Next on the program, we have a very special talk by Jim and Terry Staples. You may recognize the name Staples from Staple Covell Mill, some other things if you've been looking at the artifacts and the history here. Well, Jim is the great-grandson of Hiram Staples, and his grandmother was Rebecca Covell, Covell being another very famous name in this area. And they've brought some things along here for you to look at as well. He grew up in Grand Rapids, and they met there. They've been married for 56 years, he and his wife Terry, and they occasionally are here during the summer. We're very delighted to have them with us today. Their home, as Terry will tell you, has been in the family for 143 years, 7 generations, and they're very pleased about that. So we'd like to welcome them, but we'd also like to tell people who are here, if they want to look at the exhibits, please feel free to go around the edge and look at the exhibits at the same time. We're kind of multitasking here, and that's perfectly fine. So I would like to welcome Jim and Terry Staples.
Thank you, Ann. I'm going to only speak about 20 minutes, and I'm going to be a little bit more the historical and figures and that sort of thing. And Terry's going to take about 10 minutes to tell you what life was like in the home of a lumber baron in the glory years of, say, the 1880s. I am going to start specifically talking about my family, and you'll hear the name quite frequently, but that's what I know most about, so I can speak with most authority. My sources are, in a sense, family memories. I was born in 1931, lived in Grand Rapids, and we came up here every weekend during the 30s and into the 40s until gas rationing put the kibosh on that. But I'm amazed at what I recollect from an 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old. I just sat there listening to stories. Another source is Dan Yake's scholarly masterpiece, his 1990 doctoral dissertation in history at Kansas University. And then there's a wonderful book called History of Muskegon County, published in 1882, which makes interesting, factual, and funny reading all at the same time. And then, of course, in the computer age, I'm able to do my own research. Okay, family started with my great-grandfather, Henry Staples, a farmer in Poughkeepsie, New York, and he comes here in about 1855 in shirt sleeves. His son is Hiram Staples of the Staples and Covell Mill that we hear quite a bit about. Hiram was a blacksmith. He worked for Mr. Hills of Hillsdale, and then came to White Lake and, in effect, made a fortune in the lumber business on White Lake. His son Dudley, my grandfather, led the good life. He was essentially a rich man's spoiled son. And my father Henry wound up as an engineer with a degree from Michigan Agricultural College. Some of you know it as Michigan State University today. The family's business that is interesting to this group is the Staples and Covell Lumber Company, which was a 50-50 partnership between great-grandfather Hiram Staples and Lyman T. Covell. That's my great-grandfather with his wife Rebecca Covell, and there's Lyman Covell on that big flat picture there. They formed their partnership in 1871, which was a fortuitous time. In 1870, the U.S. government cut the channel through to Lake Michigan, and that really opened it up for logging. In 1871, Hiram and Lyman bought the mill right there, which was at the entrance of the White River to White Lake. It was the old Hinchman and Covell mill, and it was renamed, of course, Staples and Covell. It was torn down in 1874 and 5, and the Staples and Covell mill, which you got to turn your heads around, way back there on the right-hand side with a tall smokestack, that was built, and that was state of the art in 1875. They just didn't come any grander than that. And they did process a lot of logs. It cost $30,000 without the land. It operated until 1907, and it was the last operating sawmill on White Lake. It burned due to a spark from a passing train in 1917. At its height in those glory days of the 1880s, it employed 60 people. They would cut 10 million board feet a year. as I said, great-grandfather Hiram made a fortune, and I've always wondered how wealthy was he? Well, I have in the family a journal from the Staples and Covell mill dated 1883, I think it is, and all that neat Palmer-style handwriting. At the very end, December 31, they ran the totals, and that company made $22,200 in net profit that year. So that each of Hiram and Lyman took home $11,100. Well, how much was a dollar in 1881 worth today in 2010? There's all sorts of ways to figure it, but my favorite way is to figure out what did a 1 pound loaf of white bread cost in 1882 and how much does it cost today? Well, it cost about 2 or 2.5 pennies in 1882, and Plum's has a 1 pound loaf of white bread on sale today for about $1.50. So that comes out to about, 50, 60 times. If you want to think in terms of a yearly salary, the unskilled, low-level worker in the mill made about $430 a year. If you want to compare that to the current minimum wage in Michigan, $7.40 an hour, and you look at it for a year, which is $25,400, and you do the mathematics, again you come out with about 59. But of course, the unskilled labor in the mills in 1880 worked 6 10-hour days, and of course now the fellow works 5 8-hour days. On the other hand, they didn't pay any income tax in those days. So it was all take-home pay. Well, what was it like? What were the conditions like to work in a mill in those heydays in the 1880s? Well, here Dan Yates gives us a real good insight. Quote, "The available evidence suggests that work in a sawmill was dirty, physically demanding, and often dangerous. Traditionally, sawmill laborers worked between 11 and 12 hours per day, 6 days a week, in poorly ventilated and constructed buildings. They worked near saws, engines, and boilers that were only occasionally supplied with safety devices. Sawmill accidents were commonplace, and unless a laborer belonged to a benevolent society, there was often no insurance to cover the injured man or his family, since the injured party was usually considered at fault." Cornelius Steckity later recalled the hazards of working in Muskegon's sawmills, which applies to the White Lake sawmills. Although his comments refer to immigrants from the Netherlands, they apply with equal force to inexperienced sawmill workers from all nationalities, all 15 or 20 of them that worked in the area. The laborers, not being accustomed to work with machinery because most of them had come from farms in the old country, frequently met with accidents. Some were killed, some suffered fractures of arms and legs, lost fingers, so on. One horrible accident occurred a few years ago. Someone had invented the refuse burner, and one of these devices was erected near one of the mills. Pieces of bark, sawdust, and other waste were brought to it from all parts of the mill by an endless belt. So hot was the fire in the burner that it burned everything, no matter how green or wet it might be. The son of Albert Dornbus fell into this fire and was burned alive in a few minutes. They weren't all that way. Staples and Covell's mill, erected in 1874, had a 100-foot tall smokestacks, 4 foot in diameter, and then from the history of Muskegon County, this mill is a model of neatness, which is owing to the watchful supervision of the proprietors and their foreman, Mr. Jesse Pullman. And the moral I take away is, like any human endeavor, there's some folks that do it right and some folks that don't do it quite right. What was the White River lumber industry? Well, loggers cut 200-year-old pine, hemlock, cedar, oak, maple, and ash trees. They always cut the pine first because that was the most valuable wood. What made it valuable? Well, pine is very light. That meant that it would float on a river. You didn't have to have a railroad to take it out. And Mother Nature supplies the river system. Also, it's very strong, very light, and easily worked. They weren't so worried about working. They weren't doing much carving. They were mostly sawing in the boards, but it had a lot of good qualities. The 1871 Chicago fire did spur the lumber industry in the White River. On the other hand, that wasn't the sole factor. In those days, Iowa was growing. All the Illinois towns outside of Chicago were growing. Indiana was growing. And it was really a boom time. This is from the history of Muskegon County in 1882. Notwithstanding the immense quantity of pine taken from the Muskegon Valley, it will not be exhausted for many years to come and will probably outlast any locality in the United States. There are also large amounts of other kinds of lumber, such as hemlock, cedar, oak, maple, ash, that will find a market and be manufactured as soon as pine becomes scarce. Indeed, it can be said with truth that the lumber business has but little more than fairly got beyond the commencement. And the amount actually manufactured will be undiminished a long time. There is probably no man living today that will see the end of the lumber business in the valley of the Muskegon. When tracts of pine are too far distant from the river to be hauled with teams, railroads are constructed from the river to them, thus largely extending the area and lumber resources of the valley, and leaving the question of the possibility of exhaustion so far in the future as to be without any significance at this time. So what happened? Well, in 1881, 120 million board feet of lumber were cut on the White River. In 1896, 14 years later, 12 million board feet were cut. In other words, 1/10. So how big was the White River logging industry in the 19th century? Actually, we were tied for 9th with Grand River, River St. Clair, and Mackinac Shore. The biggest producer of lumber in Michigan was Saginaw Valley, 31 billion board feet. Muskegon was second with 30 billion board feet. How did a typical mill owner operate? Well, Staples and Covell were typical. An early 1880s plat book showed that they had acquired 30,500 acres in Oceana County near the north branch of the White River. They paid Uncle Sam $50 for every 40-acre tract, so they had a $38,000 investment in land. They used the river, White River, and the north and creeks, and they used specifically the north branch of the White to float log mills, to float logs to the White Lake, where the sawmills cut them up into lumber after the spring rains. The last river drive was 1903. It was so puny that Whitehall Forum didn't even want to publish the figures. The last sawmill in operation closed down in 1907, and that was the Staples and Covell mill. And then I mentioned earlier that it burned down in 1917. Now, as the river drives petered out, Staples and Covell bought logs from farmers who cleared their land. You know, a guy may buy 80 acres, but the northeast 7 acres weren't cleared away, so he'd clear them away, and he'd accumulate a pile of logs and drive them down to the Staples and Covell mill. And my dad said that Staples and Covell always paid a fair price. And how did they figure out what the price was? Well, they used what Dan Yates showed a little while ago, which was a log scaler. And you lay it across like this, and you read off of here, and it says 222 board feet. And so they would pay them to pay the farmer on the basis of 222 log feet. My understanding was there were two types of scales. One was very accurate for small butts, and the other was very accurate for large. And so you kind of paid your money and took your choice if you were a farmer and wanted to go down to the mills, and you wanted to know which scale they used, because the mill would always use the same one so that they treated everybody fairly. The logs had to be marked at their ends in several radial locations so that they would be easily visible in the water. Early on, a letter was cut into the bark. Dan Yeeks has his theory on that, and my theory is that this was an anti-hijacking precaution, because there were guys on the river who were unscrupulous enough to snag a log, cut off the end with a log mark, put their own on, and put it back into the river drive. On the other hand, if somebody had an H or an X, and that was associated with the original log mark, it was pretty hard to be a pirate in those circumstances. As time went on, more and more lumber was shipped by rail from White Lake, and the Staples and Covell had excellent customers in Fort Wayne and Indiana, and then much of their lumber went east, because after all, the eastern forests had been depleted. But a lot of it went to Illinois towns outside of Chicago, and Iowa was growing, and all those towns were demanding lumber. How did the business actually work? Well, it started with a timber cruiser. A timber cruiser was a fellow who knew how to assess raw timber standing in the forest. In other words, he would go through an acre or a parcel that a mill owner was thinking of buying, and he would come back and report that, yeah, I think there's 80,000 board feet in that parcel. Or he would say there's only 45,000 board feet. And then that would tell the mill owner whether he really wanted to buy it or not. My dad went out with a timber cruiser, and he said it was a wonderful experience. Horse and buggy, drove over a carpet of pine needles, very smooth, because there wasn't any sunlight on the forest floor, so there wasn't any brush to get in the way. And they just drove up and down, and the guys kept figuring. If the land was bought, a camp would be built, and there would be 50 to 100 men in the camp. Dan Yates noted that there was somewhere between 15 and 20 nationalities represented. Of course, we know there was a lot from Scandinavia, but Germans and French Canadians, a lot of people. The typical day was a lot of work, described last night by our speaker. One thing that caught my eye was that in the mess hall there was absolute quiet at dinner time. And the owners wanted it that way, because conversation led to raised voices led to raucousness led to a brawl led to injuries. They didn't want that. So it was very quiet. And in the late fall, when the teams were being recruited, some of the mill owners would advertise how good their cooks were, because the fare was pretty mundane, beans and pork, One mill owner advertised, all the apple pie you want for breakfast. Pretty good treat, really. I like it. The men's backgrounds, they were farmers. Farming was obviously slow in the 4 cold months, and they had a family to feed. Many single men, some other men with just secondary income, some were drifters from camp to camp. But once they got in the woods, they became a real team, because it was a dangerous place to work, and you really caught heck from your fellow workers if you were careless with what you were doing. So once they got into the woods, they became a real team. The woods operations were about 4.5 months long, early December through, say, mid-April. They had various skills. The axemen felled trees at BDH, breast diameter height, about 4.5 feet. And that was a convenient size to work one of these big band saws. And the tail would go back and forth like this. You didn't want to get down and do it down here. That's terrible. The swampers built roads from where they were cutting the trees to the camp. Sawyers cut these logs into 16-foot, 4-inch lengths. 4 inches was needed to square off the logs in case there was a little angle on the cut, so that when the log finally exited the sawmill months later, it would be a true 16-foot length of lumber. And there's lots of log markers, including Staples and Covell and Hitchman and Covell, and over here in the table. The skidders skidded the logs to the roads with the oxen. And then haulers and loaders loaded the logs onto skids and took them to the camp for storage until the spring rains. And there was always somebody out putting water on these logs at the end of the day, so they'd freeze overnight, so that we'd have a nice slippery surface in the morning, which the oxen and the horses' feet could more easily haul the logs. They didn't want any mud out there. The logs were taken from the camp to the high rollway when the spring rains came, and there's the high rollway right there on the north branch of the White River. My dad says he knows that spot, but I never, when we went fishing, I never quite spotted it. And what's happened is the chocks have been pulled out, the logs have come tumbling down, they got a jam. And so here's a lumberjack on this side with a pair of oxen, and here's the lumberjack over here, and they're trying to find the key log. And this guy says, I think this is the key log. And so they hook it up, and the lots of a pull, and if he's right, the rest of them will come tumbling down. It was dangerous work. The work on the river was done by about 300 men. 200 were up there in the tributaries and the rivers, pushing the logs, taking them off the high rollway and pushing them around bends. And there was 100 men at the booming grounds down there, just where the river enters White Lake. The business was a separate business called the White River Log and Booming Company, and it had the nature of a cooperative. There was 250 shares. Staples and Covell had 20 shares, or 8%, and Hiram Covell was the president of it for years and years. And some sawmill owners only would buy one share. Obviously, they wanted the company to handle their logs on the river drives. So I suspect there was very little profit in the business. During the river drive, many times the lumberjacks would intentionally create dams. And that would be true on the north branch of the White, which is a rather small stream, big enough when there's a lot of water, but some shallow spots. What they would do, they would lay a boomstick across the water, and the boomstick would catch the logs, and the logs would jam up behind it. As the water deepened above this temporary jam that the jacks created, the sackers would loosen the heavy logs that got hung up further up when the water was shallow. And after they got all those hang-ups down to the jam, why then, of course, they would destroy the jam and let them go on down. But in the meantime, another crew would go on a mile downriver, laid another boomstick across, and started another jam to fill up the water. This would go on and on, mile after mile, until the natural increase in the water depth said we don't need to make any more of these temporary jams. The logs came down the river and through the booming grounds, and there's the booming grounds right there in the White River above entrance to White Lake. And over here you see the smokestack of the Staples and Covell Mill, which is right there where the lake, where the river entered into the lake. The booming pen workers would collect logs at each mill's booming pens, and here these guys are out there on those platforms, and they're sorting logs as they come down the river. And they wait till the pens got a full load of logs for, they say, the Heald and Avery mill, and they would connect. Then the logs would be made into a raft, which was just a series of logs tied together with chains by their end, and a little steam engine boat from the mill would come up and grab that raft of logs and tow it on down the river, where it would go into a booming ground at that mill, and that was their supply of logs for the saws. Did they make money? Yes. The lumber prices were generally on the upward trend, but it was a risky business, and the lumber prices did go up and down, and if you were working on the margins, bankruptcy was always a constant threat. Thus, it was a common practice for these lumber barons to put as many assets as possible in their wife's name. So if bankruptcy loomed, the family would still have a home. And the Staples home at 222 Mears Avenue is a classic example of just that eventuality. Well, did the mill owners always operate at maximum speed and efficiency so as to make as much money as possible while the timber supply was plentiful? And the answer, I think, is yes. They made hay while the sun shone. About 60 plus years ago, I heard a comment from my dad that Staples and Covell owned land in Gogebic County in the Upper Peninsula. Gogebic County being the Michigan county that borders Wisconsin. But I could find no family record which confirmed this. However, a month ago on the internet, I found that on December 5th, 1884, Hiram Staples and Lyman Covell, and two of Lyman's brother, Andrew Jackson Covell and C.E. Covell, obtained 7,300 acres of timber in Gogebic County, and it was bought from the U.S. government for $50 per 40 acres, $9,000 total, and it was sold to the four of them as individuals, not as a company. Now, I find no evidence that it was ever logged, but the timing gives a reasonable basis for speculation. In 1884, the timber business was at or near or just past its prime on the White River. I surmise that Hiram and Lyman believed the White River timber would not last forever, so they sought out an untapped source, and here they landed on the Upper Peninsula. Why did they not develop it? My guess is that the Whitehall mill required their full attention until the mid-1890s. By that time, Hiram was about 60 years old, and so was Lyman. Lumbering is the business of a young man in his 30s or 40s or 50s. It involves long hours, hard work, tough decisions, and administrative challenges. Obviously, either Hiram or Lyman would have to take up residence in Ironwood to superintend the startup of the woods operation and build a mill. Now, if you were satisfied with your station in life and your quest for money was more or less satisfied, would you voluntarily move to an isolated backwoods town at age 60 and solve new challenges? I suspect they decided not to, and hopefully I'm going to discover how they disposed of the Gogebic land. Possibly they sold it to a later operator because the Upper Peninsula lumber industry was about 10 years behind the Lower Peninsula industry. How did the industry end? Well, it ended in a whimper, so far as I can tell. The great majority of acreage reverted to the state of Michigan for non-payment of taxes. And these lands form the great bulk of what today are the public lands of the Manistee National Forest. In 1901, Lyman Covell carried on the business as Lyman T. Covell Lumber Company in Whitehall, in what is now the Chamber of Commerce building. The big lot just south of Hanson Street, across the street, held shingles, lumber, and building supplies. Lyman's daughter, by his second, much younger wife, sold 40-acre cut-over pieces to farmers or whoever wanted to buy land up into the early 1940s, I believe. I have to mention that the Staples and Covell Lumber Company has the dubious distinction of being home to the greatest tragedy ever befalling any lumber company in the state of Michigan. On August 14, 1894, the steam engine at the Staples and Covell mill, or camp, just 2 miles north of the Muskegon-Oceana county line and about 2 miles east of New Era, took a multi-car load of logs to the high rollway. The engineer and 8 loggers rode the engine. They unloaded the logs at the high rollway, and the engine started back to the Staples and Covell camp. One logger decided to walk. As they steamed back to the camp on this narrow gauge railroad, the loggers were playing checkers in the cab. When almost back at the camp, as the engineer brought the engine around a sharp curve, he spotted a log across the tracks. He slammed on the brakes, but too late, the engine hit the log and it upended. The furnace door opened and hot coals poured back on the 7 loggers and the engineer. It was an agonizing scene, described in the papers of the day. Men had stomachs burned away. One man was in such intense pain that he just bashed his head on a stump, and the next day they found traces of his brains on the stump. The morphine quickly ran out. 7 men died rather quickly. Fred Shocker, the teamster, survived the impact with the log okay, but then he went back to the cab to try to rescue some of his buddies, and he was severely burned. A court of inquiry was set up to investigate this tragedy, and they investigated and came back with a decision, unavoidable accident, which is not an unreasonable verdict, it seems to me. The benevolent societies chipped in for the families. There is a family legend which came down through my Aunt Marie, or Molly Anderson, that Staples and Covell helped the families. But unfortunately, I couldn't find any written documentation to that effect. I do know that a lawsuit was threatened, and therefore Hiram, on his visits to camp, always used his fastest horse and his lightest buggy. He kept the horse hitched and pointed toward the Muskegon County line. And this, of course, was because in those days, if you wanted to serve papers on a defendant, you had to serve it on him in the county in which the claim arose. And so he was going to take no chances. I never discovered any indication that a lawsuit was filed. Traces of the wreck remain to this very day. If you go east on Arthur Road to Henry Fisher's farm on the north side of the road, which is west of the north branch of the White, look at his barn. The Staples and Covell narrow gauge railroad